February 13, 1924, Captain Isoroku Yamamoto arrived at the United States Naval War College in Rhode Island as part of a Japanese naval delegation. He was 40 years old, a veteran of the Battle of Tsushima, where he had lost 2 fingers, and he had just completed 2 years of study at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. This was not his first exposure to America. It was his continuation of an education that would shape everything he understood about industrial power and the mathematics of war. During those 2 years at Harvard, Yamamoto had not simply studied in classrooms. He had enrolled as a special student in English, focusing on economics and petroleum sources. But his real education came from traveling. He hitchhiked across the country during summer vacations, an unusual practice for a Japanese naval officer, but one that gave him direct access to American industrial operations. He visited oil fields in Texas and Mexico. He studied drilling techniques, refining processes, and transportation logistics. He became so knowledgeable about petroleum production that American oil companies offered him jobs when he completed his studies. Yamamoto declined. His duty was to Japan's Navy, not to American oil companies, but the offers demonstrated how thoroughly he had mastered the technical and economic aspects of the petroleum industry. He observed American business practices that differed fundamentally from Japanese approaches. American companies operated at scales that seemed impossible in Japan. Manufacturing facilities employed thousands of workers. Transportation networks moved raw materials and finished products across continental distances. The infrastructure existed to support industrial operations that Japan could barely imagine. Yamamoto studied the railroad networks that connected American industry. He observed how efficiently freight moved from mines to factories to ports. He saw how the American transportation system enabled industrial production that would be impossible without such infrastructure. Japan's railroad network was tiny by comparison. The implications for military logistics were obvious. He saw the scale of American agriculture in the Midwest. Farms stretched to the horizon. Mechanization was transforming agricultural production. A single American farm could produce more grain than entire Japanese villages. The food surplus supported massive industrial cities. Japan, by contrast, struggled to feed its population even in peacetime. Any prolonged war would create food shortages that might become catastrophic. He visited steel production facilities in Pittsburgh. The mills operated continuously. The output was staggering. American steel production in the early 1920s exceeded 50 million tons annually. Japan's entire steel industry produced approximately 2 million tons per year. The 25-to-1 ratio in steel production alone would determine any industrial war's outcome. He observed shipbuilding capacity on both coasts. American shipyards could launch vessels at rates that Japan could not hope to match. The infrastructure, the skilled labor, the supply chains, the capital investment, all existed at scales that made American shipbuilding a strategic weapon in itself. And everywhere Yamamoto looked, he saw excess capacity. American industry was not operating at maximum output during peacetime. Factories could increase production. More workers could be hired. Additional shifts could be added. The industrial potential was vast and largely untapped. Yamamoto developed what he would later call a healthy respect for American industrial capacity. But respect was an understatement. What he had developed was a deep understanding that Japan could not win a prolonged industrial war against America. The mathematics were simply too unfavorable. In February or March of 1924, shortly after his Naval War College visit, Yamamoto made one more trip that would reinforce everything he had learned. He traveled to southeast Texas to visit a small Japanese agricultural colony near the town of Orange. The colony was owned by Kichimatsu Kishi, a fellow veteran of the Russo-Japanese War and a graduate of the University of Tokyo. Kishi had come to America in 1906, seeking land to farm rice. After examining potential sites in California and the American South, he had settled on property near what was then the town of Terry, citing its flat landscape, ample rainfall, and friendly local population. He paid $72,000 for 3,500 acres. The Kishi Colony grew to include 32 men, 5 women, and 4 children at its peak. They farmed rice successfully until World War I, when the widening of the ship channel between Sabine Lake and the Sabine River allowed salt water to creep into Cow Bayou, the colony's primary irrigation source. The salt water ruined the rice crops. Plummeting rice prices after the war forced the farmers to diversify into vegetables, cotton, figs, and cattle. Then in 1919, oil was discovered on Kishi's property. The eastern edge of his land sat on a deep salt dome that would produce the orange oil field boom of the 1920s. The discovery made Kishi a millionaire practically overnight. He was able to pay off all his creditors and began buying more land, eventually owning 9,000 acres. He leased drilling rights to Gulf Production Company, Sun Oil Company, and Humble Oil and Refining Company. Count Kojiro Matsukata, president of Kawasaki Dock Company, made a large investment in Kishi's venture, and the Orange Petroleum Company was formally created. Yamamoto's visit to this small Japanese oil operation in Texas was motivated by strategic concerns. Japan was expanding its navy under the 8-8 plan, which called for 8 battleships and 8 cruisers as a minimum fleet standard. The plan required vast amounts of oil, which Japan could not produce domestically. Yamamoto was investigating whether Japanese interests could develop reliable petroleum sources outside of Japan's direct control but within reach of Japanese capital and expertise. He was accompanied by Vice Admiral Kenji Ide, a senior officer who would later serve in important naval commands, and Michio Kaku, Yamamoto's longtime traveling companion who served as counselor at the Japanese embassy in Washington. Kaku would later become head of the New Orleans Japanese consulate, maintaining his connections to Japanese business interests in the American South. They inspected Kishi's drilling operations. They discussed production rates, refining capabilities, and transportation logistics. They talked about the technical challenges of oil extraction and the economic viability of small-scale petroleum operations. According to accounts from Kishi's family, they spent an evening discussing oil supply for what Yamamoto called the Japanese war machine, though whether this referred to general naval expansion or specifically to war planning remains unclear from surviving records. After the visit, Yamamoto reportedly advised the Nippon Petroleum Company to consider establishing operations in America to secure oil supplies for Japan's navy. The company was not interested. Japanese petroleum companies preferred to rely on imports rather than invest in foreign production facilities. This decision, like so many others, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of strategic vulnerability. Japan was building a modern navy that required oil. That oil came overwhelmingly from potential enemies. And Japanese industry was making no serious effort to develop alternative sources or reduce dependency. Yamamoto saw the problem clearly. Oil would determine future wars. Japan imported 90% of its petroleum. 80% of those imports came from the United States. Any conflict with America would begin with Japan already in a strategically impossible position. The Texas visit reinforced everything Yamamoto had observed during his 2 years at Harvard. American petroleum resources were vast. Japanese resources were nearly non-existent. The gap could not be closed by determination or tactics. It was a geological and geographical reality that would shape any future conflict. Yamamoto understood the implications. Any war with America would be shaped by this dependency. Japan would be fighting a nation that not only supplied most of Japan's oil, but also produced 63% of the world's total petroleum output. The strategic vulnerability was absolute. Years later, Yamamoto would express his understanding of American industrial power in a statement that would be quoted throughout Japan's military and political leadership. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. Whether Yamamoto personally visited automobile factories in Detroit remains unclear from surviving historical records. What is clear is that he understood American automotive production represented a form of industrial capacity that could be rapidly converted to military purposes. Assembly lines that built civilian vehicles could build tanks and trucks. Manufacturing facilities that produced cars in peacetime could produce weapons in wartime. The infrastructure existed, the expertise existed, the scale existed, and Japan had nothing comparable. When Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1924, he carried with him a conviction that would shape his entire career. Japan must never fight a prolonged war with the United States. The industrial mathematics made such a conflict unwinnable, but convincing Japan's political and military leadership of this reality would prove impossible. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Yamamoto rose through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy while maintaining his conviction that war with America must be avoided. He was promoted to captain in 1923, a recognition of his growing expertise and leadership potential. In 1924, he made the career-defining decision to change his military specialty from gunnery to naval aviation. This was an unusual choice for a senior officer. Gunnery was the traditional path to high command in navies around the world. Naval aviation was new, unproven, and somewhat suspect among conservative naval officers. But Yamamoto had studied World War I aviation reports while at Harvard. He understood that aircraft would transform naval warfare. He recognized that carrier-based aircraft would eventually replace battleship guns as the decisive weapon in fleet actions. His decision to specialize in naval aviation placed him at the forefront of the revolution in naval tactics that would define World War II. His first major aviation command came as executive officer of the Naval Air Training School at Kasumigura, 40 miles northeast of Tokyo. The school had been built on the suggestion of a British advisory mission and trained most of Japan's naval aviators. Yamamoto introduced innovations that dramatically improved pilot training. He required all pilots to train in night-flying operations, a skill that most navies considered too dangerous for routine training. He pushed for more realistic combat exercises. He insisted on higher standards for carrier landing qualifications. Some pilots complained that Yamamoto's training was too difficult, that the standards were unrealistic. Yamamoto's response was documented in multiple sources. The Japanese fleet lags a long way behind the West. There is very little time to attain their level. That is why I regard death in training the same as a hero's death in action. If we are not prepared to accept these risks in training, we will not be prepared for war. The philosophy was harsh but effective. Japanese naval aviators became among the best-trained pilots in the world. When the Pacific War began in 1941, Japanese carrier pilots were tactically superior to their American counterparts. This advantage came directly from Yamamoto's insistence on rigorous training standards established in the 1920s. From 1926 to 1928, Yamamoto returned to the United States for his second extended tour, serving as naval attaché at the Japanese embassy in Washington. He was now a captain with a growing reputation within the Japanese Navy. His assignment was to observe American naval developments, assess American shipbuilding programs, and understand American strategic thinking. Yamamoto traveled widely during this second American tour. He visited American naval bases and observed fleet exercises. He attended social functions where he met American naval officers, some of whom would become his opponents in the Pacific War. He became an avid poker player, spending long evenings at the card table developing his understanding of probability, risk assessment, and psychological warfare. When asked how he learned bridge so quickly, Yamamoto explained that if he could keep 5,000 Chinese and Japanese ideographs in his mind, keeping track of 52 cards was not particularly difficult. His gambling skills impressed American officers, but also led him to develop a low opinion of American naval leadership. He found many American officers to be complacent, more interested in golf and social activities than in serious professional development. He considered the United States Navy a club for golfers and bridge players. This assessment was partially correct, but dangerously incomplete. American officers in peacetime were indeed less intensely focused than their Japanese counterparts. But American naval leadership understood industrial mobilization in ways that Yamamoto's fellow Japanese officers did not. More importantly, Yamamoto's second American tour reinforced all his earlier conclusions about industrial capacity. American shipyards were expanding. American steel production was growing. American oil fields were producing at increasing rates. The gap between American and Japanese industrial potential was not shrinking, it was widening. In 1929, Yamamoto was promoted to Rear Admiral at age 45. He served as Chief of the Technological Division of the Naval Air Corps, a position that gave him direct control over aircraft development programs. He championed the development of fast carrier-based fighter planes with extended range and superior maneuverability. This advocacy would lead directly to the creation of the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, which would dominate Pacific air combat in the early years of the war. The Zero fighter represented Yamamoto's understanding of how carrier aviation would determine naval warfare. The aircraft prioritized range and maneuverability over armor and pilot protection. It could fly longer distances than any comparable fighter. It could outturn any opponent. In the hands of well-trained pilots, it was devastatingly effective. But its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that any hit was likely to be fatal. The design philosophy accepted pilot casualties in exchange for tactical superiority. It was a calculation that worked well early in the war, when Japan had experienced pilots. It became catastrophic later when replacements lacked the training and skill to exploit the Zero's advantages while surviving its vulnerabilities. In 1930, Yamamoto attended the London Naval Conference as part of Japan's delegation. The conference was convened to extend and modify the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which had established ratios for capital ship construction among major naval powers. The treaty limited Japan to building 3 capital ships for every 5 built by the United States or Britain. This 5-5-3 ratio had been accepted reluctantly by Japan in 1922. By 1930, Japanese nationalists and military leaders viewed it as intolerable. Yamamoto argued passionately for Japanese naval parity with Western powers at the conference. He called the existing ratio a national degradation. He demanded full equality for Japan's navy. His arguments were forceful and well presented. He made the case that Japan faced security threats that required a larger fleet. He pointed out that Japan's geographic position required naval strength to protect sea lanes essential for national survival. But even as Yamamoto argued publicly for parity, he understood privately that the argument was based more on national pride than strategic reality. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to engage in a true naval arms race with America. Even if the treaty limitations were removed, Japan could not match American shipbuilding potential. The steel, the shipyard capacity, the skilled labor, the capital investment, all these factors favored America by ratios that treaty limitations could not change. Yamamoto's public advocacy for naval parity was political necessity. Japanese public opinion demanded it. Nationalist factions insisted on it. To argue against parity would have been political suicide and would have ended his career. But his private understanding remained unchanged. Treaty limitations were not what prevented Japan from matching American naval power. Industrial capacity was the real limitation. In 1934, Yamamoto commanded the 1st Carrier Division, giving him operational control over Japan's most advanced naval aviation forces. He continued to innovate carrier tactics and training procedures. He studied carrier operations intensively, developing doctrines for massed carrier strikes that would later be employed at Pearl Harbor and throughout the early Pacific campaigns. In 1935, Yamamoto headed the Japanese delegation to another London Naval Conference. By this time, the international situation had deteriorated significantly. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931. The League of Nations had condemned Japanese aggression. Japan had withdrawn from the League in 1933. German rearmament was accelerating under Adolf Hitler. The post-World War I international order was collapsing. At the 1935 conference, Japan demanded complete equality or threatened to abandon all naval limitation treaties. Yamamoto was the senior military representative, chosen because his technical expertise and international experience made him the most effective spokesman for Japanese demands. The conference failed to reach agreement. Japan withdrew from the naval limitation system in 1936, The era of negotiated arms control ended. The failure of the 1935 conference marked a turning point. Without treaty limitations, naval construction accelerated in all major powers. But the acceleration was not equal. American shipyards began expanding programs that Japanese industry could not hope to match. The very outcome Yamamoto had feared was materializing. Naval competition without artificial constraints would demonstrate conclusively the industrial disparity between Japan and America. And in 1936, he was appointed Vice Minister of the Navy, one of the highest administrative positions in Japanese naval command. From this position, Yamamoto became increasingly vocal in his opposition to policies that might lead to war with America. When Japan invaded China in 1937, Yamamoto opposed the operation. He understood that a prolonged land war in China would drain Japanese resources and increase the likelihood of conflict with Western powers. His opposition earned him hatred from nationalist factions within the Japanese military. Young army officers called him a traitor. Extremist newspapers questioned his loyalty. Yamamoto received death threats regularly. In December 1937, Japanese aircraft attacked and sank the American gunboat Panay on the Yangtze River in China. The Panay was clearly marked as an American vessel and was flying American flags. The attack occurred in broad daylight. 2 American sailors died and dozens were wounded. The incident created an international crisis and pushed America and Japan closer to war. Yamamoto, as Vice Minister of the Navy, personally apologized to United States Ambassador Joseph Grew. The apology was unusual. Senior Japanese officials rarely apologized directly to foreign ambassadors for military actions. But Yamamoto understood how dangerous the situation had become. The Panay incident demonstrated that elements of the Japanese military were acting recklessly, without adequate control from civilian or even senior military leadership. Young officers in China were initiating actions that could provoke war with America, and the political structure in Tokyo lacked the strength to restrain them. Yamamoto's apology to Grew was both diplomatic necessity and personal conviction. He genuinely regretted the incident because he saw it as a step toward the war he desperately wanted to avoid. Grew noted in his diary that Yamamoto appeared sincerely distressed by the attack and worried about its implications for Japanese-American relations. But Yamamoto's apology and his known opposition to aggressive policies made him a target. Throughout 1938 and 1939, opposition to Yamamoto intensified dramatically. Young military officers, particularly from the army, spoke publicly against him and other admirals who opposed aggressive expansion and alliance with Germany. They called these officers defeatists. They questioned their loyalty to the emperor. They suggested that opposition to expansion was tantamount to treason. The death threats became specific and credible. Police intercepted letters detailing assassination plans. Intelligence reports identified nationalist groups planning to kill Yamamoto. The threats were not abstract political rhetoric. They were operational plans with identified targets, methods, and timing. The Navy assigned guards to protect Yamamoto constantly. He could not move through Tokyo without security. His residence was watched. His office was secured. Military police monitored his activities, ostensibly for protection, but actually to ensure he did not take actions that contradicted national policy. The situation became so dangerous that close associates advised Yamamoto to moderate his public statements. But Yamamoto refused to be silenced. At a meeting of senior naval officers in 1938, he made a statement that was recorded in multiple accounts. "To die for emperor and nation is the highest hope of a military man," Yamamoto said. "After a brave, hard fight, the blossoms are scattered on the fighting field, but if a person wants to take a life instead, still the fighting man will go to eternity for emperor and country. One man's life or death is a matter of no importance. All that matters is the empire." The statement was fatalistic but also defiant. Yamamoto was saying he would not change his positions out of fear of assassination. If nationalist extremists wanted to kill him for opposing war with America, he would not give them the satisfaction of silencing his warnings through intimidation. The crisis reached its peak in September 1940, when Japan signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. Yamamoto had been one of the most outspoken opponents of this alliance throughout the negotiation process. He argued publicly and privately that the pact would accomplish nothing positive for Japan while making war with America nearly inevitable. He pointed out that Germany and Italy were fighting in Europe and could not help Japan in the Pacific. He argued that American public opinion, which had been divided about involvement in foreign conflicts, would unite against Japan if Japan allied with Nazi Germany. Yamamoto's opposition to the tripartite pact was documented extensively. He made his positions clear in cabinet meetings, in discussions with civilian political leaders, and in conversations with fellow naval officers. Multiple sources record his warnings that the pact was strategically foolish and morally wrong. The backlash nearly cost him his life. Assassination plots multiplied. The threats became so severe that Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai made a decision that probably saved Yamamoto. On August 30th, 1939, Yonai appointed Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet and sent him to sea. The appointment removed Yamamoto from Tokyo, where assassins could reach him. It gave him command of Japan's most powerful military force, and it put him in an impossible position. Yamamoto opposed war with America. But if war came, he would be the officer responsible for fighting it. In mid-1940, Prime Minister Konoe asked Yamamoto directly about the outcome of a possible war with the United States. Yamamoto gave him a brutally honest assessment. If ordered to fight, Yamamoto said he could guarantee to run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year. He could achieve dramatic victories. He could seize territory across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But he had utterly no confidence for the second and third years of the war. The statement became one of the most famous quotes in Japanese military history. It was repeated in various forms throughout the Japanese government. It was discussed in cabinet meetings and military planning sessions, but its meaning was consistently misunderstood or ignored. Japanese political leaders heard the first part. 6 months of victories, running wild across the Pacific, seizing vital resources. They wanted to believe that Japan could win a short war, achieve strategic objectives quickly, and force America to negotiate peace before American industrial capacity fully mobilized. They did not hear the second part. No confidence for the second and third years. The implicit warning that a prolonged war would be mathematically unwinnable once American factories converted to military production. Yamamoto tried to be even more explicit. In January 1941, he wrote to Diet member Sasakawa Ryoichi, who had recently inspected Japanese naval forces, and expressed confidence that Admiral Yamamoto would lead Japan to victory. Yamamoto thanked him, but included a stark warning. To defeat the United States in a war, Japan would need to do more than capture some American territories or even occupy San Francisco. Japanese forces would need to march across the entire North American continent to Washington and dictate terms at the White House. Yamamoto asked rhetorically whether Japanese political leaders truly had the confidence and resolve to do that. The implication was clear. They did not. Therefore, Japan should not go to war. But by 1941, the decision was no longer in the hands of officers like Yamamoto or even moderate politicians like Konoe. The military was pushing for war. The army wanted access to resources in Southeast Asia. The nationalists believed Japanese spirit would overcome American material advantages, and the strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly. In July 1941, Japan occupied southern French Indochina, putting Japanese forces within striking distance of British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. The United States, Britain, and the Netherlands responded with an oil embargo. Japan lost access to 80% of its petroleum imports overnight. The embargo created a strategic crisis for Japan. Oil reserves were sufficient for perhaps 3 years of normal peacetime consumption, but only 18 months if war increased consumption rates. Japan faced a choice: withdraw from China and Indochina, accepting national humiliation and abandoning years of military expansion, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force knowing that such action would certainly provoke war with America. In October 1941, Hideki Tojo became Prime Minister. Tojo was an army general, a nationalist, and an advocate for war. He was Yamamoto's political enemy. Many observers thought Yamamoto's career was finished, but Yamamoto's immense popularity within the Navy protected him. His fellow admirals knew no other officer could lead the combined fleet as effectively. Even Tojo understood that if war came, Japan needed its best strategist in command, so Yamamoto remained in his position. And when the decision for war was made in November 1941, Yamamoto set aside his personal opposition and did what military officers are trained to do. He followed orders. He planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. The operation was strategically brilliant and tactically devastating, but it emerged from profound strategic pessimism rather than confidence in victory. Yamamoto recognized that Japan's only chance for success required destroying the American Pacific Fleet before it could respond. If American battleships and carriers were eliminated in the first strike, Japan would have perhaps 6 to 12 months to establish defensive positions across the Pacific and seize vital resources before American industrial production could rebuild the fleet. The plan violated conventional Japanese naval doctrine, which had focused for decades on a decisive fleet engagement in waters close to Japan. Instead, Yamamoto proposed sending Japan's carriers across the Pacific to strike Hawaii, over 3,000 miles from Japanese bases. The operation would put Japan's most valuable assets, its 6 large carriers, at enormous risk. If the attack failed, or if American forces detected the fleet before it struck, Japan would lose carriers it could not replace, and the war would be lost before it truly began. Many senior officers opposed the plan, precisely because of these risks. The Naval General Staff argued for more conservative operations closer to Japanese territories. They wanted to seize resource-rich areas in Southeast Asia first, and let the American fleet come west where it could be destroyed in favorable conditions. They believed Yamamoto's plan was too risky, and that losing the carriers in a failed operation would be catastrophic. Yamamoto threatened to resign if his plan was not approved. He told the Naval General Staff that the Pearl Harbor operation was Japan's only chance to avoid certain defeat. Without eliminating the American Pacific Fleet immediately, Japan would face the full weight of American industrial power from the war's first day. The time needed to mobilize that industrial capacity would be perhaps 6 to 12 months. If Japan could not establish defensive positions and seize critical resources during that window, the war would be lost. The argument was ultimately persuasive not because others shared Yamamoto's strategic vision, but because no one else had an alternative plan that offered any hope of victory. The Naval General Staff approved the operation reluctantly, with many officers expecting it to fail. Yamamoto personally supervised the training for the attack. The operation required flying tactics that had never been attempted in combat. Torpedo bombers would need to attack in shallow water, dropping torpedoes that would not dive deep enough to hit the harbor bottom before running into American ships. Conventional aerial torpedoes would simply bury themselves in mud. Japanese engineers developed modifications to torpedoes based on techniques the British had used at Taranto in 1940. The modifications were partially successful, but remained unreliable. Dive bombers would need to hit specific targets on moving ships or in crowded harbors where precision was essential. Level bombers would need to strike from high altitude against ships that could maneuver. Fighter aircraft would need to establish air superiority over Hawaii's considerable defenses. Every aspect of the operation pushed the limits of what naval aviation could accomplish in 1941. Training was intense and realistic. Japanese pilots practiced torpedo runs in Kagoshima Bay, which resembled Pearl Harbor's depth and configuration. They practiced dive bombing against mock-ups of American battleships. They rehearsed fighter sweeps against defenders. Casualties occurred during training as pilots pushed aircraft to their limits. Yamamoto accepted these losses as necessary. Better to discover tactical problems during training than during the actual attack. On December 7, 1941, 350 aircraft launched from 6 Japanese carriers struck Pearl Harbor. The attack achieved tactical surprise, despite multiple warning signs that American intelligence either missed or failed to interpret correctly. 18 American warships were sunk or disabled. Over 2,000 Americans died. More than 1,000 were wounded. The battleship Arizona exploded with the loss of nearly all her crew. The battleship Oklahoma capsized. Multiple other ships were damaged or destroyed. But the attack failed to achieve its primary strategic objective. American aircraft carriers were not in port. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea on various assignments. These carriers, not the battleships, would determine the Pacific War's outcome. Their survival meant that American naval aviation remained intact and capable of contesting Japanese operations from the war's first weeks. Additionally, the attack failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's infrastructure. Oil storage facilities, repair yards, submarine bases, and administrative buildings remained largely undamaged. This allowed the American Pacific Fleet to recover far faster than Japanese planners had anticipated. Ships that appeared destroyed in December were back in service within months. The infrastructure needed to support Pacific operations remained functional. Yamamoto did not celebrate the attack's tactical success. Multiple witnesses reported that while his staff cheered and congratulated each other, Yamamoto spent the day after Pearl Harbor in apparent depression, withdrawn, and uncommunicative. He understood what others did not yet grasp. The attack had awakened American industrial capacity. American public opinion, which had been deeply divided about entering the war, was now united in determination to defeat Japan. The sleeping giant he had studied 20 years earlier was now fully awake and filled with terrible resolve. Everything Yamamoto had seen in America would now be turned against Japan with the full force of industrial mobilization. For 6 months, Yamamoto's prediction came true in its first phase. Japan ran wild across the Pacific. Japanese forces captured Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Japanese carriers raided Ceylon and struck into the Indian Ocean. Japanese armies advanced through Southeast Asia with minimal resistance. It appeared Japan was winning, but the appearance was deceptive. Japan was spending limited resources at unsustainable rates. Oil reserves were depleting, even as captured oil fields required months to restore to production. Japanese shipyards could not replace losses fast enough. Japanese industrial capacity could not expand to match operational requirements, and American industry was mobilizing exactly as Yamamoto had warned. By May 1942, American industrial mobilization was proceeding at rates that exceeded even Yamamoto's pessimistic calculations. American shipyards were launching 1 cargo vessel every day, soon to increase to multiple launches daily. American aircraft factories were producing planes at rates that exceeded total Japanese annual production. Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, Lockheed, North American, Grumman, and other manufacturers were expanding facilities and hiring tens of thousands of workers. Training programs were graduating thousands of new pilots every month from schools established across the American South and Southwest. The industrial mobilization was comprehensive. Automotive factories in Detroit converted production lines from civilian vehicles to tanks, trucks, and armored cars. The same assembly line techniques that built automobiles now built M4 Sherman tanks at rates approaching 1,000 per month per factory. Steel mills expanded output to feed the demand for ships, vehicles, and weapons. Aluminum production increased to support aircraft manufacturing. Rubber production shifted almost entirely to military uses. Chemical plants expanded to produce explosives and propellants. American petroleum production in 1942 exceeded 1,300,000,000 barrels, 63% of world output. California fields alone produced more oil than all of Japan's captured territories combined. Texas fields operated continuously at levels that dwarfed anything Japan could access. Pipeline construction connected fields to refineries and refineries to ports, creating an infrastructure that could support unlimited operations. The numbers were staggering and verifiable. By 1943, American shipyards launched more tonnage in a single year than Japan built during the entire war. American aircraft production in 1944 reached 96,000 planes, compared to Japan's peak of 28,000. American tank production exceeded 86,000 during the war. American truck production exceeded 2 million vehicles. The industrial output was overwhelming. More importantly, American industry maintained quality while increasing quantity. Ships launched quickly were mechanically reliable. Aircraft produced at high rates met performance specifications. Weapons manufactured in mass quantities functioned correctly. The industrial system was not simply producing volume, it was producing effective military equipment at scales that determined strategic outcomes. Japanese industry could not respond. Japanese shipyards lacked the capacity to replace carrier losses. Japan built 6 large carriers during the entire war. America launched over 100 carriers of all types. Japanese aircraft production peaked in 1944, then declined as raw materials became scarce. American aircraft production continued increasing through 1945. Japanese tank production never exceeded a few hundred per year. American tank production never dropped below several thousand per month after 1942. The industrial gap was exactly as wide as Yamamoto had calculated 20 years earlier, and it determined the war's outcome exactly as he had predicted. The turning point came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Yamamoto planned an operation to lure American carriers into a decisive battle. Japan would achieve numerical superiority, destroy the remaining American fleet, and force America to negotiate peace before industrial advantages became overwhelming. The battle was a catastrophic defeat for Japan. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. Hundreds of experienced pilots died. Japan's offensive capability was broken. And most significantly, the battle occurred almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's timeline had been accurate to within weeks. After Midway, the war became a mathematical equation. American industry produced. Japan could not keep pace. American shipyards launched more carriers in 1943 than Japan built during the entire war. American factories produced more aircraft in 1944 than Japan's total industrial output. American oil fields pumped more petroleum in a single month than Japan had captured from all conquered territories combined. The numbers were exactly as devastating as Yamamoto had calculated in his mind 20 years earlier when he studied American industrial capacity. The assembly lines kept running, the factories kept producing, and Japan had no answer. Yamamoto would not live to see the final outcome. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications revealing Yamamoto's flight schedule. He was planning an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. Admiral Chester Nimitz faced a difficult decision. Targeting Yamamoto personally would achieve a major psychological victory, but might reveal to Japan that America had broken their naval codes. Nimitz decided the risk was acceptable. Yamamoto was irreplaceable. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters flew over 400 miles from Guadalcanal to intercept Yamamoto's transport plane as it boating approached Balalay airfield. They shot down his aircraft over the jungles of Bougainville. Yamamoto died in the crash. He was 59 years old. He had been commander-in-chief of the combined fleet for less than 4 years. American newspapers celebrated the death of the architect of Pearl Harbor. Japanese propaganda mourned a national hero who died in service to the emperor, but neither narrative captured the full truth of who Yamamoto had been. He was not a warmonger who wanted to attack America. He was not a pacifist who refused to fight. He was a realist who understood industrial mathematics and tried desperately to prevent his country from committing strategic suicide. The irony of Yamamoto's career is profound. He spent nearly 2 decades warning Japan about American industrial capacity. He explained repeatedly that a prolonged war with America was unwinnable. He opposed every policy that pushed Japan toward conflict. He was threatened with assassination for his prophecy opposition, and when war finally came, he was the officer ordered to fight it. Every warning he gave was ignored. Every prediction he made came true. After the war ended in 1945, historians began examining the documents and records from Japan's decision-making process. What they found was remarkable. Yamamoto's warnings had been documented extensively. His reports from America in the 1920s described American industrial capacity in detail. His statements to political leaders were recorded in meeting minutes. His famous quotes about running wild for 6 months were widely known throughout the Japanese government. The information was not hidden. The warnings were not secret. Multiple prime ministers heard them directly. Dozens of senior military officers read the reports. Hundreds of staff members had access to the assessments. But institutional momentum was powerful. Nationalist ideology dismissed inconvenient mathematics. Military factions prioritized expansion over strategic reality. Political leaders lacked the strength to resist the army, and Japan chose war with the one nation Yamamoto knew could not be defeated in a prolonged conflict. Prince Fumimaro Konoe, the prime minister who had asked Yamamoto about the prospects for war, did not survive to see Japan's surrender. He committed suicide on December 16, 1945, by ingesting potassium cyanide rather than face arrest for war crimes. He had served briefly in the post-war cabinet, but came under increasing suspicion. The night before his scheduled arrest, he spent hours talking with his son about the invasion of China, negotiations with the United States, and the heavy responsibility he felt toward the emperor and the Japanese people. Konoe had opposed war with America until the end. In summer 1941, he had even proposed an unprecedented meeting with President Roosevelt in Honolulu to avoid conflict. But he lacked the political strength to overcome the militarists. When Hideki Tojo became war minister in Konoe's cabinet, Konoe found himself unable to control military policy. He resigned in October 1941, weeks before Pearl Harbor. The lesson of Yamamoto's story is not primarily about naval tactics or strategic planning. The lesson is about the relationship between industrial capacity and national power in modern warfare. Wars in the industrial age are not won exclusively through tactics or courage or superior training. Those factors matter in individual battles. But prolonged wars between industrial nations are decided by production capacity. They are won by nations that can outproduce their enemies. They are won by countries with vast natural resources, sophisticated manufacturing infrastructure, and the ability to convert civilian production to military purposes rapidly. Yamamoto understood this. He tried to explain it to his country. Japan chose to ignore him. During World War II, American factories produced approximately 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, millions of trucks, thousands of ships, and essentially unlimited ammunition and supplies. Japan's total industrial output could not match American production in any major category. The ratio in most areas was 5-to-1 or greater in America's favor. These numbers were predictable. Yamamoto had calculated them approximately 20 years before the war began. He knew what American automotive factories could produce. He knew what American oil fields could supply. He knew what American steel mills could manufacture. He had seen it with his own eyes during his years in America. The tragedy is that this knowledge existed at the highest levels of Japanese government and military command. It was documented, it was discussed, it was available to decision-makers, and it was systematically ignored because it contradicted what nationalist ideology wanted to believe. In 1947, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey published comprehensive analyses of Japan's wartime industrial production. The numbers confirmed everything Yamamoto had warned about. Japan's petroleum imports had been cut to 10% of peacetime levels by 1945. Japanese aircraft production peaked at 28,000 planes in 1944, compared to American production of 96,000 that same year. Japanese steel production never exceeded 7 million tons annually during the war, while American production exceeded 80 million tons. The industrial gap was exactly as wide as Yamamoto had calculated, and it had determined the war's outcome exactly as he predicted. Today, historians studying the Pacific War recognize Yamamoto as a complex figure. He was a brilliant tactician who planned Pearl Harbor. He was a strategic realist who opposed the war that made Pearl Harbor necessary. He was a military professional who followed orders even when he believed those orders would lead to national catastrophe. And he was a prophet whose warnings were documented, distributed, and ignored. The quote attributed to Yamamoto about awakening a sleeping giant and filling it with terrible resolve is probably fictional, invented for movies, but the sentiment captures a truth. Yamamoto did understand that attacking America would awaken industrial capacity that Japan could not match. He did warn that American resolve, once committed to total war, would not accept negotiated peace. And he did predict that Japan would run wild for 6 months before industrial reality made further success impossible. Those predictions came from his time in America during the 1920s. They came from observing oil fields in Texas. They came from understanding American manufacturing capacity. They came from recognizing that modern war is determined by industrial production as much as by military skill. And they came from a simple willingness to accept mathematical reality even when that reality contradicted national pride and ideological conviction. Yamamoto's life demonstrates that possessing accurate strategic intelligence is not sufficient to prevent catastrophic decisions. The intelligence must be believed. It must be acted upon. It must overcome institutional momentum, ideological bias, and political cowardice. Japan possessed accurate intelligence about American industrial capacity. Multiple leaders understood the implications. The warnings came from Japan's most respected naval strategist, and Japan went to war anyway. The assembly lines kept running, the factories kept producing, and the mathematics played out exactly as Yamamoto had calculated 20 years earlier when he studied American industry and understood what it meant for the future of warfare. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. These forgotten details from World War II deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to stay connected with plays, more untold histories. Each one matters. Each one teaches lessons about the relationship between accurate intelligence and strategic decision-making. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from historians to military professionals to people who understand that the past illuminates the present. Thank you for watching. Thank you for helping us preserve these stories.